On January 15, 1974, the quiet city of Wichita, Kansas, awoke to a crime that would change its history forever. Wichita was the kind of place where neighbors trusted one another, doors were often left unlocked, and families felt safe. That sense of safety shattered when the Otero family's home became the scene of a chilling and incomprehensible tragedy. When law enforcement entered the residence, they discovered a scene that was both tragic and unsettling. For members of the Otero family, parents Joseph and Julie, along with two of their children, were gone. The discovery shocked the community to its core. The randomness of the crime, the brutality behind it, and the lack of any clear motive left investigators scrambling for answers. But the most haunting part of this crime was not just what had happened. It was that someone out there had done it, someone who had the ability to blend back into society unnoticed. Wichita had unknowingly become the hunting ground for one of the most infamous killers in American history. This was the beginning of the story of Dennis Rader, the man who would later be known by 3 chilling letters: BTK. Those letters stood for bind, torture, kill. It was a name he chose for himself, one that he would later sign in taunting letters sent to police and the media. But in 1974, no one yet knew who he was. To the public, he was an invisible predator. To the police, he was a ghost who left almost no trace. And to his victims, he was the embodiment of fear. At first, investigators had no idea that this crime was just the beginning. They thought perhaps it was a burglary gone wrong, or maybe even a personal vendetta. But in the shadows, the man responsible knew exactly what he was doing. He had carefully planned, he had watched his victims, and he had carried out his plan with precision. And when he walked away, he carried with him a dark satisfaction, knowing that the city was now gripped with fear. Weeks passed, then months. The community mourned the Otero family, but life tried to move on. Still in the background, detectives worked tirelessly, chasing leads that went nowhere. There were no solid witnesses. There was no clear evidence pointing to anyone. The killer had been methodical, and he seemed to vanish into thin air. For a time it seemed like the case might go cold. But BTK was not done. He wasn't content to simply commit his crimes and disappear. He craved recognition. He wanted people to know he was out there. And so he began to write. The first letters he sent were detailed, describing the crime scenes with an accuracy only the killer could know. He gave himself a name, BTK, and demanded that the media print it, ensuring his identity, or at least the identity he had created, would become infamous. This was not just about the crimes. It was about control. BTK wanted to control the narrative, the fear, and even the investigators themselves. For police, the letters were both a blessing and a curse. On one hand, they provided confirmation that the murders were connected, that this was the work of a single individual. On the other hand, they revealed just how much this person enjoyed playing games. He wanted to be seen. He wanted the attention. And he was willing to taunt law enforcement just to feed his ego. This set the stage for a decades-long game of cat and mouse. BTK would strike, then disappear for long periods of time. He would re-emerge with a letter or a clue, reminding everyone that he was still out there. For the people of Wichita, this meant living with a constant unease that the killer could be anywhere, hiding in plain sight. And the most chilling part, that's exactly what he was doing. Dennis Rader was, to all appearances, an ordinary man. He was a husband, a father, a church leader, and even a compliance officer for his community. To his neighbors, he seemed like the last person who could be responsible for such horrors. But beneath the mask of normalcy, Rader lived a double life. One side of him was the friendly neighbor, the man who waved from across the yard. The other side was BTK, the predator who meticulously planned his attacks, kept detailed records, and relished in the fear he created. As the years passed, more crimes followed. Each time, investigators were left frustrated. Each time, BTK seemed to slip through their fingers. And each time, he fed his desire for attention by writing again, by reminding the world that he had not been caught. What made him especially terrifying was his patience. Unlike other killers who acted impulsively, BTK was methodical. He could go years without striking, lulling the city into a false sense of security before emerging again. It was this unpredictability that made him so difficult to catch, and so deeply unsettling to the people who lived in his shadow. By the late 1970s, the name BTK was infamous. Parents warned their children, people locked their doors, and fear lingered in every corner of Wichita. The police remained under pressure, not just to catch him, but to restore a sense of safety to the city. And yet, despite their best efforts, BTK continued to evade them. Little did anyone know, it would take 3 decades before his mask would finally slip. 3 decades of waiting, watching, and planning. 3 decades where an ordinary man led an extraordinary double life, one that would shock the world when the truth was finally revealed. This was not just a story of crime. It was a story of obsession, of deception, and of a killer who believed he could outsmart everyone. But as history would prove, even the most meticulous predators can make mistakes. And for BTK, those mistakes would eventually lead to his downfall. As the 1970s moved forward, Wichita changed. The once calm, family-centered city was now living under a shadow. People no longer felt comfortable leaving their doors unlocked. Families started double-checking their windows, and strangers became objects of suspicion. The Otero murders had been shocking, but what made them worse was the realization that the person responsible was still out there. And he wasn't finished. In April of 1974, just a few months after the Otero case, BTK struck again. This time, his victim was Catherine Bright, a 21-year-old woman who lived with her brother Kevin. On what seemed like a normal day, Dennis Rader entered her home. Kevin returned unexpectedly, leading to a violent confrontation. Kevin managed to fight back and even survived the attack, but Catherine tragically did not. This case provided investigators with something they hadn't had before: a living witness. Kevin Bright was able to describe the attacker. But even with his account, police still couldn't identify the man. The description didn't lead to any arrests, and BTK seemed to vanish again. For the people of Wichita, the fear grew. If this man could break into homes in broad daylight, if he could attack entire families, then no one felt safe. And the way he chose his victims was particularly terrifying. They weren't connected. There was no clear pattern. He seemed to pick people randomly, which made predicting his next move nearly impossible. It was around this time that BTK decided to make his presence known again. He began sending more letters, taunting police and the media. In his writings, he described his crimes in chilling detail. He referred to his actions as projects, as if the lives he took were part of some twisted hobby. He spoke of his Factor X, an uncontrollable urge inside him that he claimed drove him to kill. To investigators, the letters were infuriating. Not only did they confirm that BTK was responsible for multiple crimes, but they also showed just how much he enjoyed the attention. This wasn't just about committing murder. It was about creating fear, playing with the authorities, and making himself into a figure of terror. By 1977, BTK struck again. This time, his victim was Shirley Vian, a mother of 3. Her children were locked in a bathroom while their mother was attacked. When police arrived, they were horrified to discover the crime had taken place while her children were just steps away. The randomness of BTK's choices meant that no one could feel safe. He didn't just target people living alone. He didn't just target families. There was no way to predict who might be next. And this unpredictability made him one of the most feared killers in America at the time. The following year, in 1978, BTK struck again, this time killing Nancy Fox in her home. Afterward, he did something that left investigators stunned. He called the police himself. In a calm voice, he reported the crime, giving them directions to Nancy Fox's residence. The call was traced to a payphone, but by the time police arrived, the killer was long gone. This boldness showed just how much BTK enjoyed the game. It wasn't just about the crime itself, it was about the cat-and-mouse chase that followed. He wanted to demonstrate that he was in control, that he could decide when to appear and when to vanish. Throughout the late 1970s, Wichita police dedicated countless hours to catching him. They interviewed hundreds of suspects, followed every possible lead, and brought in FBI profilers to better understand the mind behind the crimes. The profile described BTK as a man who blended into society, someone organized, intelligent, and meticulous. They believed he lived a double life, one side normal and the other consumed by darkness. And they were right. But in real life, Dennis Rader seemed like anything but a monster. He was married, had children, and was active in his church. He even held a position as president of his congregation. He was employed as a compliance officer, enforcing city codes, which gave him a sense of authority. To those around him, he was a normal, responsible man. No one suspected that behind closed doors, he was keeping detailed journals, drawings, and plans of his crimes. In fact, Rader's ability to appear ordinary was one of the main reasons he avoided capture for so long. He looked like the kind of man who would never raise suspicion. And in a way that made him even more terrifying. The late 1970s turned into the 1980s, and then into the 1990s. As time passed, the BTK case grew colder. There were still occasional leads, but none ever led to an arrest. BTK himself seemed to have disappeared. Some wondered if he had died, moved away, or simply stopped killing. For Wichita, the fear slowly shifted into a haunting memory, something people still whispered about but no longer felt pressing. But BTK hadn't disappeared. He was still there, living his life in Wichita, watching, waiting. And he still craved the attention. For years, BTK vanished from public sight. From 1991 to 2004, there were no new crimes attributed to him, no new letters, no new taunts. For many in Wichita, this silence brought a sense of relief. Maybe he was gone. Maybe the nightmare was over. But the truth was different. Dennis Rader was still there, hiding in plain sight. During these years, he raised his family, served in his church, and worked as a local government employee. He enforced neighborhood codes, often frustrating residents with his strictness, but still, no one suspected the double life he lived. In some ways, this quiet period was even more chilling than the crimes themselves. It showed that BTK could turn his urges on and off, that he could live as a normal husband and father while hiding the darkest of secrets. This ability to compartmentalize his life is what allowed him to remain undetected for so long. By the early 2000s, the younger generation in Wichita only knew of BTK as a legend, a dark story their parents remembered but one that seemed distant. The case had grown cold, files sat gathering dust, and even police had shifted focus to more current crimes. But BTK hadn't forgotten. He was growing restless. And his need for attention was about to resurface. In 2004, a local newspaper received a package. Inside was a photocopy of a driver's license belonging to a woman named Vicki Wegerle, who had been killed in 1986. Alongside it was a photograph of her body taken at the crime scene, something only the killer could have possessed. The message was clear. BTK was back. This revelation sent shockwaves through Wichita. For nearly 13 years, people thought he had disappeared. Now he had returned, reminding everyone that the man who once terrorized their city was still alive, still watching, and still eager to play his game. The police quickly reopened the case, forming a new task force to hunt him down. This time technology had advanced. Forensic science, DNA testing, and digital communication offered new ways to catch a killer. But BTK wasn't naive. He had followed the news, studied police methods, and believed he could outsmart modern law enforcement just as he had decades earlier. He began sending more letters, leaving packages, and communicating with investigators through messages hidden in cereal boxes and even at public libraries. He posed riddles, asked questions, and once again demanded attention. It was as if the silence of the 1990s had been too much for him, and now he was making up for lost time. One of the strangest questions he asked police was whether communications sent on a floppy disk could be traced back to him. He wanted to continue his taunts but was worried about being caught. Police, eager to trap him, responded publicly, assuring him that a disk would be safe. Rader believed them. And this decision would ultimately lead to his downfall. In early 2005, police received a package from BTK containing a purple floppy disk. To him, this was just another way to send a message. But to investigators, it was the breakthrough they had been waiting for. Forensic experts examined the disk and quickly discovered something Rader had overlooked. Although he believed he had erased the metadata, fragments of information remained. The disk revealed it had been used at a church computer in Wichita. Not only that, but the document on the disk had been last modified by someone named Dennis. It was the clue that connected decades of mystery to a real person. Investigators began focusing on Dennis Rader, a 59-year-old church council president and city compliance officer. On the surface, he seemed ordinary, even dull. But as detectives dug deeper, they uncovered unsettling patterns. Rader had lived in Wichita during all the murders. His job as a compliance officer gave him knowledge of neighborhoods and homes. And his church involvement matched the clue from the disk. The evidence was mounting. To confirm their suspicions, investigators needed DNA. They discreetly obtained a sample from Rader's daughter's medical records. When tested, the results showed a familial match to the DNA found at multiple BTK crime scenes. It was the proof they needed. On February 25, 2005, Dennis Rader was arrested. For the people of Wichita, it was a moment of shock. How could the man they saw at church, the man who issued neighborhood citations, the man who seemed so ordinary, be BTK? But as the investigation unfolded, the truth became undeniable. Rader confessed to his crimes in chilling detail, recounting his projects and explaining how he had stalked and planned his attacks. He described how he lived two lives, one as a family man and another as a predator who fed his dark fantasies. For law enforcement, his capture was a relief but also a haunting reminder of how long he had gone undetected. For Wichita, it was the end of decades of fear, but also the beginning of a painful reckoning with the reality that BTK had been one of them all along. Dennis Rader's arrest was only the beginning of the final chapter. What followed was a trial that shocked the world. At first, some believed he might plead not guilty or try to deny his involvement. But Rader surprised everyone. In court, he calmly admitted to 10 murders. He described each one in disturbing detail, speaking with a cold, matter-of-fact tone that revealed no remorse. What unsettled many was the way he spoke, not as someone ashamed, but as if he were proud of his meticulous planning. He explained how he chose his victims, how he stalked them, and how he carried out his attacks. He referred to them as projects, dehumanizing his victims and reducing them to tasks on a list. The courtroom was stunned. Families of the victims listened in horror as Rader recounted what he had done. The public, too, was disturbed by how ordinary he looked. He didn't fit the image of a monster. He looked like a neighbor, a co-worker, a friend. And that was what made him so chilling. In August 2005, Rader was sentenced to 10 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. He would spend the rest of his life in prison. For Wichita, justice had finally been served. But the scars remained. The fear that BTK created had lasted for decades, and even after his capture, the memories lingered. Parents still told their children about the years when the city lived in fear. People still remembered double-checking their locks and wondering if they might be next. The story of BTK is more than just the story of a killer. It's a story about deception, patience, and the terrifying idea that evil can hide in plain sight. Dennis Rader was not a drifter or an outsider. He was not someone living on the margins of society. He was a husband, a father, a church leader, and a community worker. He was someone trusted by those around him. And yet, he was also BTK, the man who terrorized a city for decades. His case is often studied in criminology because it shows how someone can live a double life so convincingly. It also highlights the dangers of underestimating those who seem ordinary. BTK's ability to blend in was his greatest disguise. For law enforcement, the case emphasized the importance of forensic science and persistence. It took decades, but advances in DNA testing and digital forensics eventually exposed Rader's mistakes. His arrogance, his belief that he could outsmart investigators, was ultimately what led to his capture. For the public, the story remains a cautionary tale. It reminds us that evil does not always look the way we expect. Sometimes it looks like the man who sits in the church pew beside you. Sometimes it looks like the neighbor who waves hello as he walks his dog. Today, Dennis Rader sits behind bars, serving his sentence. He will never be released, and his reign of terror is over. But the name BTK continues to haunt Wichita. It lives on in documentaries, books, and the memories of those who lived through his crimes. In the end, the story of BTK is not just about a killer. It's about the resilience of a community, the determination of investigators, and the reminder that justice, no matter how delayed, can still be achieved. The tale of Dennis Rader is chilling, disturbing, and unforgettable. But it also serves as a warning that evil can wear the most ordinary of masks, and that sometimes the most dangerous monsters are the ones we never suspect.